Okay, thanks all for inviting me here. And yeah, let me just sort of give an introduction. I mean, like most of you, I've been locked down for a few years. I retired in, I think, 2019, started working on the book or started working full time on the book. And then the pandemic hit. So usually I worked with other people on papers and projects, including several of you. But this one I sort of did on my own, which was a lot of fun. It was like, sort of refreshing in a way. No offense to any of you, but I kind of let myself go. I could do whatever I want. I didn't really talk to very many people. So it's been a lot of fun, but sometimes I really get cold feet with the social insect thing, and humans are like ant societies. Sometimes I get cold feet. What the hell am I talking about? So I'll try to, during this talk, I'll try to tell you some of the things that I'm pretty sure of, or real sure of, and some of the things that are more speculative. So, okay, next slide. All right, this is the outline of the lecture. First thing, what does evolutionary theory have to offer? And obviously, my answer is a lot. And social scientists have a real problem, I've found, with evolution and biology. I think a lot of social scientists still down in sort of 1970s sociobiology. So it was really pushed by economists. I mean, I think biologists got a bad reputation. It sort of came out as genetic determinism. And E.O. Wilson modified his views quite a bit in the years after sociobiology was published. So I'll just briefly make some remarks about that. And then there's a really useful way of looking at things. It's very simple. This is Erosion's concept of what he called dialectical analysis. Then I'll talk, of course, a little bit about hunter-gatherers and the agricultural transition. And then I'll give a take on something that I've run across recently about ants, about these ant colonies taking over the world and now contracting. And then I'll talk a little bit, this comes from work by James Scott called Against the Grain, which is sort of a pro-hunter-gatherer, anti-agriculture take on history. And then I'll talk about the coming golden age of barbarism. Okay, next. All right, so the old view of evolution is sort of one gene, one trait thing. There's a gene for blue eyes, there's even a gene for certain kind of behavior. That was the old view. And in the last, especially 20 or 30 years, the whole field of biology has really opened up. Again, I'm not a biologist. I don't want to go too deeply into it, but let me just mention something that some of you know. It's called epigenetics. And it turns out that the way genes are expressed is very complicated, and there's a lot of redundancy and contingency built into evolution. The basic idea is how genes are expressed depends on the environment, the external environment. One of the first studies of that was sex ratios in crocodiles, and it turns out that when eggs can either hatch out as males or females, and that depends on the temperature of the nest the eggs are in. I think if it's warmer, more males are hatched. If it's colder, more females. A really interesting example of that is Australian bird songs. This was published in Science last year. I think these are called zebra finches. That's a little guy there. And when the eggs are in the nest, the mother sings to the eggs. And in that song, the mother conveys information about the environment. And depending on temperature, abundance, resources, and so on, the eggs that hatch have different characteristics, different sizes, different metabolic rates, and so on. And this gives them an advantage in the sense that they can hatch out a certain phenotype that's adapted to the particular environment they're coming into. So it's really quite amazing, really. Anyway, the point is that natural selection builds in contingency in ways that we only never even thought of even a few years ago. And there's a whole field called the evolution of evolvability. So somehow encoded in genes is the ability to adapt to new situations. So yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Okay, next. Okay, it's a simple idea, but this is what Erosion, Nicholas Erosion, his representation of a dialectical concept. Okay, social scientists especially analyze concepts that are fuzzy. For example, the notion of democracy. I mean, we can classify some countries as democracies. Canada, US is now, I guess, a flawed democracy. And on B, non-democracy, so North Korea, for example. So you can give sort of polar cases, but there are a lot of cases that are, some of both. Well, it's sometimes hard to say. For example, Switzerland. Okay, I think women were only allowed to vote in Switzerland in the 1970s. Was it a democracy before that? Well, yeah, I guess, but you can make a case that it's also flawed. But to examine something analytically, you have to draw a boundary between A and B and say this is A and this is B. So over and over again, you see people getting hung up in that overlapping area there. And they find things that are both A and B that have some characteristics. And then they make the claim, well, this is not a A and B, those are not useful distinctions, or even more extreme, that they don't exist. And really, you see this over and over again. Okay, next slide. Yeah. Okay, so example of that is the transition to hunting and gathering. Okay, hunting and gathering, for most of human history, we had no agriculture, mobile communities, small groups of say 20, 25 people, 30 people, maybe larger groups in the summer. But hunter-gatherers, again, this is a definition from textbook, rely on a mode of subsistence characterized by the absence of direct human control over the reproduction of exploited resources. Okay, little or no control over the resources they harvested, plant resources or animals or whatever. Agricultural definitions, the science of an art of cultivating the soil, including pursuits of gathering the crops and rearing the livestock and so on. So the key feature is the control of all stages of production of food. So growing barley in the early years of agriculture, you clear the land, you drive other species away, you till the soil, you take care of that crop from beginning to end. Okay, very different than hunters and gatherers. 15,000 years ago, Upper Pleistocene, all cultures were hunter-gatherers. 5,000 years later, you had not only agriculture, but full-blown states that really depended, largely, almost exclusively on raising grain and producing surplus. So very different. But that period of transition, again, there are a lot of cultures that are some in between. They have characteristics of both modes of production, and it's very important to really be careful when you're in that dialectical penumbra. Okay, now next. Yeah, next slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is what I said, really. The transition from hunting and gathering was a continuum. And, the transition contains many cultures that were both A and B. It doesn't mean that these two categories don't exist. And this is sort of an annoying habit of academics, is to take a well-accepted concept like hunter-gatherer or neoliberalism or whatever, and then claim that because there are varieties and exceptions, then the concept doesn't exist or it's a flawed concept. Okay. All right, next. Yeah, next slide.
Can you not see a change?
Yeah, we see the changes.
Yeah.
Seems like
Okay,
there's a lag for you.
key points from this lecture, is that it? Yeah. Whoop. Okay, yeah, go back to the key points. Yeah, these are things that, again, I've been thinking of the last couple of years. A really key thing that I think happening now is agriculture and climate change. Okay, how can 8 billion people, or maybe 10 billion, be fed in the face of climate instability, energy scarcity, political fragmentation, and so on? So that's the thing I'll keep coming back to. Another key point, which is surprising, I'll talk about ultrasocial systems, some work I've done with Lisi Kroll and extended it in the book. Ultrasocial systems become a sort of thing in themselves. And, like a beehive, the beehive is there are bees in the hive. But the individual bees within the hive, they're there to serve the hive. And there's almost a transfer of individuality from individuals within the system to the system itself. The third thing is power. I think this is how humans are different than ants. We have power, we have castes, and ants don't. Surprises a lot of people. So the individual power over others is sort of the major internal source of instability in ultrasocial systems. Okay, next. Okay, climate change and evolution. Major evolutionary transitions are frequently driven by climate change. A lot of what made us human happened in the Pleistocene. It's an epoch or era that began about almost 3 million years ago. And this was the beginning of ice ages. Human evolution from Australopithecans, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, lots of other human types took place within the Pleistocene, especially driven by these major changes in climate regimes. Okay, next. All right, there's I would say a consensus now that climate change is really the driving force in the agricultural transition. And these two papers, I think I've got references to them at the end of the slideshow. Agriculture appeared at the beginning of the Holocene and the new warm and stable climate regime. Complex, rigidly hierarchical, very large state societies didn't appear until thousands of years later. So it took a long time. You had to develop the institutions, social structure that reinforced these state societies. You also had a sort of an agglomeration of power that took a long time. So, it's submitting to power is really not a natural human thing. I mean, hunters and gatherers and early agriculturalists had all kinds of mechanisms to limit power. And again, most of this stuff comes from the Near East. That's by far the best documented transition. Okay, next. Yeah. Maybe I'll go like that. Next slide. Yeah, this is one of my favorite slides. I try to give this in every lecture. But this shows climate instability. This goes back 450,000 years. That little blip on the far right, that's the Holocene. That's the last 10,000 years. And you can see how different that is than the rest of the diagram. They've taken this back to 800,000 years, I think. The red is CO2, the blue is temperature. But before the Holocene, even year-to-year, decade-to-decade fluctuations were such that you couldn't have agriculture. That's the point of Pete Richardson's article and the other one. The climate was just too unstable. Humans certainly knew about agriculture. They knew about plants. They would scatter seeds for the plants they harvested and, come back to them on their the annual mobility cycles. But the Holocene is just very different. Okay, next slide. Yeah, this is the last 45,000 years. Yeah, and you can see this even more clearly. Most of the last 45,000 years were colder than today, and but also again, the key thing, much more unstable. And I think that's what's going to cause the real problems in the decades and centuries to come. Is not only the heat, but the instability. And okay, next. Okay, so different modes of production generate different values. This is certainly not an original idea with me. And again, you can make this as deterministic or undeterministic as you want. But hunter-gatherers lived directly on flows from the environment. And their cultures were embedded in local ecosystems. The belief systems they held work to protect these ecosystems. You know, not because they're more moral or more environmentalists than we are. Well, they were more environmentalists, but that's because they had to be. Their lives depended on it. Their livelihoods depended on it. And agriculturalists, especially in full-blown state societies, depended on storing stocks of food. So this set off sort of another set of values, separation of humans from nature. You know, nature in some sense became an enemy because the other creatures, the other animals, you know, weeds would try to take over your gardens and so on. So it created this divide between human and non-human world. This connection still exists, of course, but another thing that happened, if you're dependent on stocks of food, like stocks of grain, wheat or barley or whatever, there's always an incentive, a need to produce more than you think you're going to require because there's uncertainty and so on. And so almost every year, you're going to have more food than that particular population needs. Okay, what happens in the natural world when you have food that will support a larger population, no matter what the species is? Then that population grows. And I think that's really, again, that's a simple idea, but I think it's one of the keys why the human population took off after agriculture. In general, these societies were able to produce more food than the current population needed. That led to larger populations. That larger population needed more food and so on. So you get this sort of expansionary mechanism or drive built into the system. Okay, next. Next slide. Yeah, here's a quote from Genesis, of course. You've probably seen this. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. God gave you the green plants. I give you everything. The fear and dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, fishes of the sea, and into your hands they are delivered. Pretty amazing. More up-to-date one, Upton Sinclair. It's difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on not understanding it. And again, so this is the kind of materialism, saying the material base maybe not determines values, but certainly reinforces, directs, guides, molds values of any society. Okay, next. Yeah, next slide. I'm going to try to. Yeah, so again, getting back to this idea of historical materialism, this is really an amazing example. This is Cortez arriving in the Valley of Mexico, I think at 1509 or something like that, meeting this was the Aztec leader who's, it's hard to say. His name is really hard to say. It's very long. It means something like descending eagle. But anyway, this was an amazing, amazing thing. And this is, if I could have the next slide. Yeah, next slide. This is from a book, Ronald Wright, a wonderful book called A Short History of Progress. So what this says up there, human agency is vastly overrated. This rubs a lot of people the wrong way. But this is what Wright writes. What took place in the early 1500s was truly exceptional. Two cultural experiments running in isolation for 15,000 years or more at last came face to face. Amazingly, after all that time, each could recognize the other's institutions. These two independently evolved civilizations were very much the same. When Cortez landed, he found roads, canals, cities, palaces, schools, law courts, markets, irrigation works, kings, priests, temples, peasants, artisans, armies, merchants, sports, theater, art, music, books, etc. But high civilization, differing in detail, but alike in essentials, it evolved independently on both sides of the earth. So something is going on there. There's something deeper than just human intentionality. And, you see this, the popular accounts over and over, humans, we invented or thought of the theory of relativity. We put a man on the moon and so on. Who is we? There's a difference between society and the individuals in that society. An example of sort of the attitude I'm arguing against is Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, which I really liked the book. It's very enjoyable. But the subtitle is something like How Civilizations Choose to Fail or Succeed. And I mean, I don't think they choose anything, so I'd really quibble with them. So if you look at this slide, a typical hunter group about 15,000 years ago, a group like that in different parts of the world evolved these very similar situations. Angkor Wat to call the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley in what's now Pakistan. I've seen all three of these, and just walking through them, I think I saw Tikal first, but you know they're just strikingly the same. I mean, it's almost, I want to use the word exactly the same, but it's just amazing how these very similar situations all developed without any contact with each other from a hunter-gatherer, simple society. Okay. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, go to the next. Yeah, okay, agriculture, how did it change? It was just changed like night and day. Competing species were driven from human settlements. Ecosystems were radically transformed. City-states developed extremely complex divisions of labor, hierarchy, economically integrated, and so on. And ironically, is the Darwinian fitness of human groups, that is Homo sapiens increase. Again, is shown by the huge population increase. That's usually a measure of success of a species. The well-being of most individuals within the group is measured by health and the quality of life declined. Next. Oh yeah, so this is what I just talked about. Agriculture allows the species essentially to create its own food supply. The need to produce surplus food and unexpected contingencies and so on. Okay, humans are not the only species with agriculture. We're the only species, the only organisms with agriculture. Ants and termites also developed agriculture with really complex societies. Humans dominate the biomass, the terrestrial vertebrate biomass. Ants dominate the insect biomass. Something like, it's estimated, E.O. Wilson estimated that the total biomass of humans and ants is about the same. Ants are in almost every corner of the earth. They dominate the ecosystems they're a part of, and so on. And they're also driven by this expansionary drive and control of domination of ecosystems, exploitation of individual ants and of the environment. Okay, this a diagram I got from Josh Farley. The purple is wild species, red is human, and blue is domesticated animals. So by 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, most of the biomass was wild species. By 1900, again, we're still basically dealing with organic agriculture here. Wild species have driven way down as a percentage, humans way up, and livestock even more. And today, this is after fossil fuels, you can see not only do humans and their livestock just absolutely dominate, but the total biomass is larger. It's about 6 times larger because of the extra energy we put in the system. Okay, yeah, next. Yeah, this is just to show the takeoff in the human population. 10,000 years ago, going back before that, 300,000 years ago, the population of Homo sapiens was under 4 million, sometimes dropping probably to a few tens of thousands. When agriculture started, the population started to kick up, but you can see it really took maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years for the first empires, the city-states, large metropolitan populations of hundreds of thousands of people, that's when the population really shot up. So it increased a little bit, say in the first 5,000 years of agriculture, to 5, 7 million, something like that. But 5,000 years later, it was 200 million by the, 0 BC or whatever. And James Scott talks a lot about what the characteristics are like in that transition period. Yeah, okay, next slide. I'm going to try to go faster. Next slide. Okay, if you get the next slide, I'm going to skip this. Yeah. All right, if you go back to the other one, I wish I could control this. Sorry. Yeah, okay, so this is, again, it's not a new idea with me, but control of the means of production, the way of making a living, is really critically important here. And this, to me, is probably the most, in terms of human well-being, is the biggest difference between hunter-gatherers and a modern industrial society. The picture on the left shows a woman taking some children out to gather, gather and maybe a little light hunting too. But children grew up in that society. They knew everything they needed to know to make a living, where the plants are, what the seasons are like, the habits of the animals they hunted, and so on. So in a way, it was like the original information economy. Everything was information because people would go into the environment and get what they needed. This other diagram, this is from a really neat little book called Karl Marx's Capital in Lithographs. And this is the ownership of the means of production. This book was written by a guy named Hugo Gellert in the 1930s. But again, we're dependent on others to get a job to make a living. We have to present our employer with skills, beg for a job. He or she gives us a job. And our employment is dependent on one person or a handful of people. Yeah. If you look at that picture, you don't have to read the second volume of Capital. Okay, climate change paved the way for agricultural societies. Point so far. Agricultural societies paved the way for industrial civilization. Okay, next slide. All right, climate change to me is sort of the thing that's really hanging over any of these discussions about sustainability and well-being and so on. The Earth most likely will warm by 3 or 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. I know that's controversial, but it just seems to me, and unless we do something really drastic and government gets together and cooperate, we're headed for that. And temperature increases will continue after that, and climate instability. So if the climate instability of the Pleistocene returns, then we're real in trouble. I mean, how are we going to feed whatever 8 billion people at least with increasing energy scarcity, increasing climate instability, droughts, floods, and all the other things? Agriculture will be increasingly difficult. And this, I wrote this book. I kind of finished this book, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And I'm surprised that we're already beginning to see this. I mean, you're getting reports now of the climate affecting agricultural prices, trade between nations, and so on. So this is definitely something to watch. Okay, next one. Oh yeah, ultrasociality. In an ultrasocial system, the group itself comes to behave as if it's a single individual. This is a little bit of an aside here, but it's important to keep this in mind. This applies to ant colonies, termite mounds, and human societies. Ants and termites have had agriculture for something like 50 million years, so they're way down the road. They're well ahead of us. Human society is not yet an ant colony. I don't think we'll become an ant colony, but we're heading in that direction and taking on some of the characteristics, because our societies, all these 3 kinds of societies, are organized around the production of economic surplus. Okay, an important point is individuality passes from individuals to the group. Individuals, in the case of termites and ants, become expendable like cells in a body. And you've heard this from Republicans during the the COVID case. We have to open up. People are going to die, but that's okay because we have to keep the economy going. All right, so related to that, social complexities associated with individual simplicity. Yeah, okay, next. There's no agreed on definition of ultrasociality. Sometimes that term is used. There's another term that the insect people use called eusociality. I go by the definition given by Donald Campbell, it's the pioneer in this field. Full-time division of labor, specialists who gather no food but are fed by others, city-states with thousands, hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. And again, Lisa Kroll and I, in earlier work, stressed the importance of agriculture and the production of surplus in driving ultrasociality. Okay. Yes, I thought I'd just throw that in. Are we becoming cogs in a machine? Yeah. Okay, next slide. So leafcutter ants, they grow a kind of fungus for their food. So they gather these leaves and they feed them to a fungus and take care of that. And that's what they eat. Dozens of specialized occupations. You see these pictures of the workers carrying leaves. Okay, one kind of ant cuts the leaves, another worker will carry it, and then another worker process it. Another worker takes care of the larva. They even have untouchable ants that clean waste from the nest. These ants are sent down to the, where the waste room is to remove the material. They're not allowed to come in contact with other ants after they go in there. You see these ants carrying the leaves. There's another kind of ant. It's a very tiny ant that sits on the heads of these workers to fend off a kind of insect, a kind of little bug that will attack the ants. And so, again, it's probably 100th, maybe even less, the size of the ants carrying the leaves. Just as an aside, amazing thing is that these ants those two kinds of ants are the same genotype. All the ants in a particular colony are the same genotype. The way the phenotype is expressed depends on the kind of food the larva is fed. And somehow the colony knows if the colony gets in a war, for example, with another ant colony, they lose a bunch of soldiers, then the next generation will be, high proportion of soldiers. It is genetics again, but it's a kind of genetics that it's just amazing. When an ant queen leaves the nest to form another colony, all she has is just the eggs, the fertilized eggs in her body. From those eggs, she lands somewhere, digs a hole, the eggs hatch. That's the first generation. From the genetic information there, the queen can create these whole civilizations of leafcutter ants, including the ability to respond to contingency and so on. So again, this incredibly complex structures can come from just the materialistic process of Darwinian natural selection. Okay, next. Yeah, this is an experiment in Brazil. A scientist in Brazil found a leafcutter ant. They said it was an abandoned ant colony, and he poured concrete in it very carefully over a period of weeks, and then excavated the concrete. Got in the tunnels, these spherical things that was in the colony. Then they excavated the whole thing, and they found this again incredibly complex civilization. You can see these things that look like ropes, so on, or tunnels that the ants make to go outside and forage and so on. These spherical things, sometimes they're brood chambers. After that, they're used as gas and temperature regulators. The level of carbon dioxide and nitrogen within these in these subterranean cities are are regulated somehow by the ants themselves. Okay, next one. This is so you can see how huge this thing is, meters and meters across. Again, it's just incredible that this same thing can be hatched out. 20 ants can go out 20 different places and reconstruct identical situations, identical civilizations like that. Okay. Yeah, so the point here is we tend to say everything animals do is instinct, everything we do is reason. Just looking at this stuff, instinct is a lot more than we think it is, and then reason is a lot less than we think it is. I think that's something to always keep in mind. Okay. This is a termite mound in Africa. Yeah, termites are just as complicated as ants, and the architecture, the engineering in these termite mounds is just amazing. More is known about ants thanks to E.O. Wilson and all of his students. Okay, next. Yeah, so insects, why are social insects important? I think they're just, they're beginning to be appreciated, but still ignored. This is from my book. Suppose we discovered deep in the Congo a chimpanzee society with complex agriculture, including the sophisticated use of antibiotics, monocultures, a complex division of labor, social classes, organized warfare, cities, sophisticated communications network. People would just be astounded. It would shake the foundation of all of science, not just social science. But, we'd see that the same thing is under our feet. And why are ant and termite societies? We just say, well, it's interesting, but it has no relevance to human society. Okay, next. Yeah, I'm going to speed it up a little bit. Okay, next slide. Oh, yeah. The concept of ultrasociality is tricky. It's like self-organization with no self. So if you think about a beehive, it's been described as being an organism, but there's no there really. There's no brain, there's no central nervous system. Somehow this whole system just evolved mechanically to accomplish a certain feature, to build a certain feature, again, you can call it a civilization that gets passed on from generation to generation. So these things, they don't have minds or purpose. Again, they evolved through Darwinian natural selection because such structures are efficient in extracting and using scarce resources from the environment. So Lisa and I use this concept of ultrasociality. There's nothing supernatural about the concept. We may want to get into that later. But again, self-organizing systems with no self. And so the language gets really tricky. We talk about, the purpose of an ant colony is to produce surplus, but it's just tricky. Okay, next. Yeah, let me just mention this, and then I think I'll go to the last point I want to make. Ultrasociality is not benign. This again comes from Donald Campbell, something called downward causation. Okay, somehow these ants, like leafcutter ants, apparently started as hunter-gatherers. Groups of ants, 80 to 100 ants, hunting centipedes and things like that. And somehow they developed agriculture, division of labor, and all that. So Donald Campbell said all processes at the lower levels of a hierarchy are restrained by and act in conformity to the laws of higher levels. So suppression of autonomy at the lower level facilitates efficient functioning at the higher level. So with social insects, the collective intelligence can be just amazing without a corresponding high level of individual intelligence. Okay, next. Okay, individual versus social complexity. Okay, ultrasocial societies work by suppressing individual behavior. And you think of ants in an ant colony. They go out, they gather information. That information is transferred to this higher level, thing that's not a thing. to be usable, that information needs to be as simple as possible. So if some ants are sent out to find a new nest site, then all the superorganism needs to know, again, I'm using this anthropomorphic language, is this a good nest site or not? So in the ants vote, if the more ants that pick a particular site, then that's the site that gets selected. I mean, imagine if an ant was super intelligent and every site it conveyed all the information about the site. Well, here it has good sunlight, it's a little further from a food supply. You know, the organism couldn't use that information. It has to be yes or no. Okay, next. Yeah, Adam Smith, I mean, none of these ideas are new. Totipotency, this is a term from the ant literature. It just means the ability of an individual in one of these societies to perform the task that the other members can perform. In hunters and gatherers society, you know, depending on gender and age, one person can do pretty much the same as anybody else can. You have the knowledge to perform that task. Later on, it's not true. So this is Adam Smith. In a rude society called barbarous societies, there's a great deal of variety in the occupations of every individual. Although there's not a great deal in those of the whole society. Every man is capable of doing almost everything which any other man is capable of doing. In a civilized society, there's little variety in the occupations on the greater part of individuals. There's an almost infinite variety in the whole society. Just another quote by Smith: "The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations becomes as stupid and ignorant as possible for a human creature to become." So again, these are not new ideas. Okay, next. Yeah, next. Okay, this is an amazing thing. There's a guy, James Tranello at Boston University, who's a student of E.O. Wilson. Yeah, back to the next one. Student of E.O. Wilson, and he's done a lot of research on ant brains. And it turns out that ants in ultrasocial colonies ant brains are significantly smaller than the brains of ants in smaller groups. They're like 10 to 15% smaller on the average. Likewise, the human brain has shrunk by about 10% since the beginning of agriculture and ultrasociality. So offloading tasks is some sort of collective consciousness, so that's another term I don't like, it's used a lot, is one explanation for the shrinking human brain. So in the last few thousand years, collective intelligence has increased. We have all this information, libraries and internet and so on, but individual intelligence has declined. And there is a strong but controversial correlation between brain size and intelligence. So from you can, if you read this stuff, if you go on the internet, just type in shrinking human brain, you can get all these papers, but they're always sort of justifying or trying to explain it. Well, we don't need bigger brains because we're not in danger of being eaten by saber-tooth tigers and so on, which may be true, but the question is, would you rather be smarter or more intelligent? We've really lost them. This is not a good thing from the point of view of an individual human if you value our intelligence and creativity and so on. And there's all this stuff written on the global brain on a very critical level. I'll talk about that at the end if we have time. Okay, next. Yeah, this if our bodies had shrunk at the same rate as our brain did, the average person would be 4.5 feet tall and weigh 64 pounds. So it's not just the encephalization. Okay, consequences of human ultrasociality. The growth imperative is built into human production systems and institutions. So there are 3 steps here, I think. First was the adoption of agriculture. That was a big leap. The fossil fuel revolution, a couple thousand years later, 10,000 years later. And the great acceleration since World War too. Okay, next. Okay, the breakdown of the old world order after the ravages of the Great Depression really ushered in this sort of new era of global growth and prosperity. Thomas Piketty has written about this and a lot of others. But the growth since World War II, really within, I was born after World War II a little bit, but this happened within my lifetime. The world population has tripled from about 2 million to almost 7.5 billion to 7.5 billion. World economic output grew by 5-fold, and energy consumption quadrupled. Okay, the new global economy has been able by suppressing in-group output rivalry, leading to homogenization of cultures. Again, best, most popular book on that was Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. Okay, next. Yeah, this is just from the World Economic Forum. Okay, is globalization winding down? Okay, this I'm not sure of. If it is, it's just beginning. You can look at, there's certainly a lot of things happening that seem to indicate that. So percentage of GDP, global exports have stalled and even started to go in reverse slightly. Globalism is sort of on the wane. It's been under attack on a lot of fronts. The power of the United States, the power that really propelled the world, is backing away from its role as policeman, trade champion, and so on. And the pandemic has accelerated this trend. It's sort of, the pandemic has kind of exaggerated what was going on before, but it's really shown clearly sort of the fragility of supply chains. And one thing that's built into evolutionary systems in biology is redundancy, contingency. There's a lot of backup in the system. The market economy in recent years has gotten away from just-in-time production and so on. So, if I have a business, I try to minimize inventories. I try to minimize all the contingency plans if something goes wrong. If everything is going well, then I'm in good shape. I can outcompete you if you take contingency into account and more careful. But I can make a higher profit. I can have lower costs if I just live from day to day. Pandemic has shown the sort of the danger in that kind of a process. Okay. Yeah, so expansion and collapse, again, is sort of this has been the pattern in human history for the last 5,000 years ago, since state societies. And, the media now is just obsessed with stories about impending collapse. There's a center for the study of collapse at Cambridge University. If you read papers like, or look at the BBC, The Guardian, almost, every other day, there's another story about collapse and someone making a prediction of impending collapse. Okay, next. Okay, ant super colonies. I will tie this together eventually. Okay, ant super colonies contain billions of workers that really spread across the globe, hundreds of kilometers. There's a very large colony in California that stretches about 100 kilometers, and there are sister colonies to that one on other continents. There's one in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, large areas of Japan, and so on. Okay, you can take an ant from any of those colonies, and it is one colony. You can take an Argentine ant from Europe, put it in the colony in California, and that ant will be accepted. But there are other colonies of Argentine ants that are not part of that colony. They'll be quickly attacked and killed if introduced into the super colony. And yeah, ant wars are another interesting thing. They estimate that battles between the California large colony and another Argentine colony results in millions of deaths of ants every month, probably billions and billions in a particular year. The Pentagon actually studies the tactics in these ant wars. They're very sophisticated, try to outmaneuver them. Okay, other kinds of ants, yellow crazy ants, can form super colonies in northern Australia, Borneo, and Christmas Island. Fire ants have done something similar. They're called crazy ants, by the way, because when you look at them, it looks like they're jumping around randomly, moving around. So not. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the collapse of an ant super colony on Bird Island in the Seychelles. So they were introduced sometime before 1997. It's kind of blurry. And that's the first one there. But you can see by 2002, these ants have taken over the whole island. But only 2 years later, they've almost completely collapsed. They estimate that 99% of the ants have died out and formed these smaller colonies. Okay, next. All right, I used the reason for that. I mean, you could look at why would ants have this kind of altruistic behavior toward other ants. There's something called the price equation. It weighs sort of the cost of altruism to an individual to the benefits of altruism for being a member of a group. So, simply put, suppose if you act totally selfishly, you have an advantage over other members of your group. You can outcompete them because you have more, you redirect more resources to yourself rather than to them. But it pays to be altruistic if it helps your group survive. If your group doesn't survive, you don't survive. So it's a trade-off between the cost of altruism and benefits in terms of does it pay to favor the group. Okay, next. Yeah. So what would make an ant cooperator, be altruistic or non-altruistic? Okay, when ants invade a new territory with a relative lack of competitors, you have all these new resources the colony needs and can use. So the returns to a larger size are enormous. That means the returns to cooperation are enormous. So it's advantageous for smaller colonies to combine to form larger colonies because the resources are plentiful. There's returns to size, economies of scale, so on. So those factors favoring expansion also promote cooperation. Okay, this dynamic changes when the limits to expansion are reached and the costs of the individuals of cooperation become greater than their rewards. So the colony expands, there's more altruistic behavior, the colony becomes larger and larger, and then resources become more scarce, then the advantages to cooperation at least are reduced or even reversed, and so the super colony falls apart. And this seems to be what's happening all over the world with these ant super colonies. Okay, next. Yeah, let me just say at this point, the first part I did on ultrasociality, the shrinking brain and all that, I'm pretty sure of. This I'm not so sure of, but I think it's just a really interesting application of what can we learn from social insects. There's something going on here that I think needs to be looked at further and may be relevant. But the basic idea, again, when resources become scarce, the returns to cooperation become less and the colony fragments. Okay, the question is this happening to human society? Okay, next. Yeah, so you see, examples of fragmentation now are all around us. The rise of far-right nationalism, resentment of those left behind. I mean, globalization didn't work for everybody. It certainly worked for people like us with analytical and verbal skills. But a lot of people, didn't benefit and even suffered, of course, from trade and all that. And then, it's resentment. Of course, bankroll rolled by conservative billionaires. I mean, that's another story, sort of the, there's something called the iron law of oligarchy, which guy named Robert Michaels developed. But he sees sort of the transition of governments and so on as being a rotation of oligarchies. And yeah, Walter Scheidel wrote about this also. There's always, in broad terms, this battle between and among the ruling class, those who believe in enlightened self-interest. We have to leave something. We can't take everything, or the society is going to be unstable and we're going to be kicked out. Versus the pure greed people. Let's grab everything we can. Yeah. So anyway, there seems to be a breakdown, sort of agreed upon values and institutions. The truckers' blockade in Ottawa. I mean, that really showed a small section of society can do a lot of damage if things start to fragment. Okay, next. Yeah. So again, ants and termites have caste. There's no hereditary wealth because there's really no inheritance. The queen is the mother of all the ants. Worker ants don't have descendants, so there's nothing to fight over. Caste systems mean hereditary wealth passed along. And humans, on the other hand, I mean, one single person can disrupt a whole society. It's sort of the fatal flaw, I think, in human ultrasociality. Wars can be started essentially by one person. Lyndon Johnson, both Bushes, Putin. It's just incredible, really. I mean, Putin could bring down civilization. I mean, probably not, but he could start a nuclear weapons exchange. And anyway, probably not. But the point is, an unstable person is in a position to do so. Couldn't happen in the ant colony. Okay. Next. Yeah, so after past social collapses, most people were better off. Scott points out that it took several thousand years after the widespread adoption of agriculture for large-scale hierarchical societies to emerge. Life under state control was a step backwards in terms of human well-being, individual autonomy, cultural richness, and so on. And Scott argues, again, looking at the Middle East, he says that in the early periods of agriculture, most of these societies were estuarine societies. They were on the edge of marshes, really rich, environmentally rich wetland areas. So agriculture was just sort of a supplement to hunting and gathering that these societies lived on. So this lasted, again, some thousands of years. And Scott says that because of climate change, the whole area became drier. The marshes started to dry up, and people had to turn more and more to grain agriculture. And that's when these large-scale state societies formed. Grain, wheat, barley, and so on, is really good for state societies because it can be taxed. Comes ripe at a certain time of year. It can be stored. It's hard to hide, so the tax collector can come around, see what you have, take what the state wants, and so on. Okay, next. Yeah, so early state societies were centralized, patriarchal, rigidly constructed according to hereditary classes, forced labor, including labor, infectious diseases, and so on. This book The Health of the Population was considerably poorer than that of hunter-gatherers. Larson argues for 10,000 years after the start of agriculture. And he had this NSF grant to do this massive study, archaeological studies of remains of people and so on. The populations were shorter, they had more disease, life expectancy was lower, and so on. Again, 2/3 of the population and even the cultures we admire, Greece and Rome, were slaves. Okay, next. Okay, Scott is a big proponent of barbarians. Barbarians, again, that was the term I think the Romans used against probably most of our ancestors. The barbarian zone is the zone, Scott, is a zone of physical, mobility, mixed and shifting subsistence strategies, illegible, that is, no writing to keep track of people, production. If the barbarian world is one of diversity and complexity, the state realm is one of relative simplicity. Okay, next. This is another guy, Beckwith. The barbarians were in general much better fed, led easier, longer lives than the inhabitants of the large agricultural states. There was a constant drain of people escaping from China to the realm of the Eastern steppe, where they did not hesitate to proclaim the superiority of the nomad lifestyle. Many Greeks and Romans joined the Huns and other Central European peoples, where they lived better, were treated better than they had back home. So we tend to, our history that we're taught, we talk about the glories of Greece and Rome and so on, and we see the period in between as being like dark ages, barbarians roaming the landscape and so on. But a lot of people are arguing now that society, the barbarian period, which generally those periods were much longer than the state societies, and they may have been better off. Just the question Scott asked is dark for whom? So are we entering another age of barbarism? Human society seems to be deteriorating and fragmenting. A turnaround of this seems unlikely, although it's certainly possible. Throughout our ultrasocial history, state societies, those at the top of the hierarchy have failed to address inequality and environmental deterioration. There's a study last year by Oxfam that found that the 8 richest men controlled as much wealth as the bottom 4 billion people on the planet. I mean, it's just incredible. So the transformation of human civilization, is bound to happen, whether it's a collapse or whether it's kind of a slow deterioration. It's too early to tell. And, sometimes it's just easier to look ahead 300 or 400 years rather than worry about what's going to happen in the next few decades. Okay. Yeah, so 300 years, 400 years, increasing climate instability. What's going to happen with inequality and power? There's bound to be social conflict over that. The end of fossil fuels. Again, it may take a while. It'll be a winding down, not just a collapse of fossil fuels, but it's happening. So what I think we should welcome in the long run the end of industrial civilization. You people, environmentalists, ecological economists, talk about this, and they spent there's a lot of articles. The first part of the article is sort of pointing out all the horrible things that civilization has given us, extermination of 70% of insects, vertebrates, and so on. And then they come up with these schemes as to how to keep the system going, do this and that. And I'm arguing just let it go. Try to make people as comfortable as possible now. Save as much of the natural world as possible. But, we should welcome this change. A decentralized small-scale future, it wouldn't be a Garden of Eden. Humans are humans. They're always going to be humans. There's going to be conflicts. There's going to be scarcity, times of scarcity, and so on. But this is, to me, just a lot more pleasing view than sort of a dystopian, homogeneous age of some sort of global brain without conflicts or constraints. Okay. Yeah, so again, what to leave future generations? What about people living now? Okay, so there are kind of two things going on here. One is the existing system. Okay, we know how to make life better for people under the existing system. And this, for me, is this traditional progressive agenda: reduce inequality, provide basic needs like healthcare, education, and so on. Treat the industrial economy like a terminal cancer patient. Okay, it's going to come to an end, but make life for people as good as possible until the end comes. Protect as much as possible of the natural world. So, the important thing to me about these social programs is we know how to do it. We don't know how to make the existing economy sustainable. And I would argue that it's really impossible to do that. Okay, next. Yeah, so here we are in 2022, and down below are some possible futures. Hunter-gatherer, small communities, friends, family, relationships, living in more or less harmony with nature. We could have some kind of mixed economy for a while, like the transition period 10 to 5,000 years ago, or we could have some sort of horrible technological dystopia where we're all sort of labeled and observed and managed. I would pick one. I would probably accept two, not three. Okay, next. It's funny. I was sort of poking around looking for a Marx quote, and I found all these really interesting Marx quotes, sort of surprising. So what should we do? Surround yourself with people who make you happy, people who make you laugh, who help you when you're in need, people who genuinely care. They're the ones worth keeping in your life. Everyone else is just passing through. I mean, it's a really nice quote, and it's a good way to start in living your life and addressing some of these issues. It's kind of, you just ground yourself in that. Okay, I think that's next slide. Yeah, okay. So I have some things at the end, but why don't it's taking too much time because I'm sorry about this PowerPoint thing, but yeah, there must be questions and complaints.
Well, thank you, John. I think that leaves a lot for spark commentary and thought, especially within the context of that final Marx quote there. Hopefully you find yourself among a group of those people. So if any of those people would like to ask a question, make a comment, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get to you. And go ahead, Josh.
Oh, great presentation, John. I have to say, I think I'm in general a little more Pollyannish than you and kind of look at rosy linings. But one of the things I was curious about, I was kind of surprised. I didn't know this about the ants, is where cooperation seems to break down as the population gets too large. Because I was thinking about like slime molds, where when resources population cooperation breaks down when resources become scarce, whereas slime molds are very much the opposite.
Yeah,
and,
right.
Mixed Cockaxanthus and these others that they cooperate in scarcity.
Yeah, they do. I don't know what to say. Yeah. I mean, they answer different than slime molds. But the slime mold case is really amazing. I mean, individual organisms, I think it's when they have to move to another place. I mean, they actually form a larger organism and then crawl or slide, whatever they do, to another area. But I mean, nature is amazing, different ways of addressing this.
But the other thing that struck me as curious about that is I think of cooperation is typically, you cooperate within a group against other groups. And in your example of, say, Shelley's, they seem to have arrived in an isolated island, populated it all, and then the breakdown. So I was curious, I was just curious about that.
I mean, I look at it, the price equation is for individuals. I'm kind of playing fast and loose with it, in that I apply it to, groups forming larger groups.
Yeah.
So when does it pay, say, 5 or 6 groups to join together? It pays when their resources are abundant, there are advantages to economies of scale and taking advantage of those resources and expanding. When resources become scarcer, then that advantage to cooperation dissipates or even disappears. And then the colony breaks up, the super colony breaks up.
And does the price equation always rely on the genetic relatedness? Because I also think of super organisms as we have cultural. The group is by cultural.
Yeah. The price equation is genetic. It's controversial and really the arguments are really convoluted. The price equation explains altruism. In terms of passing on your own genes. If your group dies, then you're going to die. Your genes don't get passed along. And the sort of extension of that is, of course, inclusive fitness. it pays to be nice to people, reciprocal. But, it's like pantheism, I guess. If God is everywhere, then he sort of disappears. It's everything, then you kind of expand this thing out of existence. So, yeah. And whether there's a lot of evidence that group selection not based on genetics is a very powerful force in evolution, too. The guy at the University of Vermont, Nate Hagenstein.
Goodnight. Charles Goodnight.
Charles Goodnight, yeah.
Who unfortunately died. Passed away. Yeah.
He's done a lot of work on it.
Yeah. And then one final question before I shut up. So I'm really curious about this idea that, you were saying, as population size of humans gets too large, we're likely to break down. And I know very clearly, like if chimpanzee groups get too large, they can have these civil war divisions and kill each other. And I always looked at humans, our ability to dramatically exceed Dunbar's number is based on our cultural adaptations and our signifiers. And so I always think of it, are certain cultures incapable of expanding beyond a certain size. And where the breakdown is just a defective culture, kind of like the US right now. These are these things I think about. I don't know my answers to. I haven't thought about that, but I'm sure it's true. I mean, cultures can be very different. I mean, there's infinite variety almost of human culture. Yeah.
There's two good books by Colin Turnbull. One is called The Eeks, and the other is called The Forest People.
Yeah.
The forest people were pygmies, whatever you call them, politically correct term, but pygmies that lived in the Congo. And that he worked with them, he lived with them off and on for years. They called those were the gentle people. I mean, he just loved these people. He considered those to be his family more than his family in England. Always nice to each other, help each other. And it was an abundant, they were able to live abundantly off that. There's another group called the Eeks, which were, I think, maybe Tanzania, but they were forcibly removed from the place they lived in and then removed to another area where the environment, the landscape wasn't suitable for their lifestyle. And they were just horrible, over decades. They were just really nasty. I mean, mothers would take food away from their babies. I mean, he dedicated that book to them, and the dedication was something like, to the people I learned not to hate. I mean, so in that case, scarcity really brought out the worst. Yeah.
So we're running up against the proposed end time. Unfortunately, because of tech issues, we haven't had as much.
Right.
Perfect.
Rushed it a little bit too. Anyway.
No problem. But if anyone just has sort of burning final questions, now's your time.
I have time to talk about one more slide.
I'll stick around.
Okay. Well, Jeff Garver just sent a question. His internet hasn't been good.
Okay.
So he sent it to the chat, and I'll just read it out to you. He said, any thoughts? I was going to ask you the same thing, so I'm glad he did. Any thoughts on the new book, The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, if you're familiar with it? He says, it seems to reject the thesis that agriculture led to civilizations that are hierarchical and specialized and non-egalitarian and so on. And instead, the different kinds of hunter-gatherer and settled agriculture have organized themselves in all kinds of ways. So the inequality in elite-led violence in complex settled societies is not necessarily inevitable. Probably an oversimplification, but he'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I have the book. I haven't read the whole thing. It's about 2/3 or 3/4 longer than it should be. I mean, there's a lot of redundant stuff there. Maybe because Graeber died just toward the end of writing it. It's too bad. No, it's a good book and a lot of good points. I don't agree with him, of course, on the transition. Again, he and his co-author are in the middle there. He does say very, very favorable things about hunter-gatherers. He's not. I think a lot of people in their desire to talk up hunter-gatherers try to make them sound more civilized, which I think is a mistake. Okay, let me give just related to that one sort of glaring error in the book. There's a society, a dig in Turkey called, it's a horrible thing to pronounce, I had a student from Turkey that one time taught me how to pronounce it. Is Serohotek or something? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes pronounced
Together.
Catalhiok.
Yeah, and that was touted for decades as being a complex society with megalithic architecture, but no agriculture. And all these crazy theories, well, hunter-gatherers got religion and they got saved or something, and they built these monumental structures. And to build these things, they had to have more people, so that's why they invented agriculture. Just ridiculous theory. Okay, the guy that did that dig was a German scientist. I can't remember his name, but so he was in charge of that for something like 15 years. There was no evidence of agriculture. He claimed that their store bins, what they would have been grain storage, was empty. There was some ceremonial thing. When he died, they started redigging, and they found all this evidence of agriculture. I mean, it was an agricultural society. I mean, of course it was, like similar societies around it. They had millet, they had storage for grain, they had tools for processing grain. So there are mistakes like that in the book, I think. Again, there's a lot of really ridiculous things written about hunter-gatherers on both sides. So yeah, in general, there's a lot of good things in the book, but not that.
Well, I think seeing as we're at 2:30 on the dot, I think I'll just say thank you, John, so much for joining us today. Really engaging. I mean, obviously there would be an hour's worth of more unpacking to be done on subjects like this. So just, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. And
great, and thanks to all. Yeah.
The next
I can come to Montreal.
That'd be excellent. Peter's already invited you out to his house. The next STandD series that L4E will be doing will be on the topic of degrowth, and we'll be having our colleague Aaron Vincentian come to talk to us about it. So you can all look forward to that in about a month from now. I know some of you might know him. And you will, of course, continue to receive emails from us. So keep your eyes open, and thank you all for coming.